Welcome to lesson 5.2. In this lesson, we'll talk about the benefits of ectomycorrhizal fungi. We'll look at the concept of the wood wide web, that of mycorrhizal networks, and how that functions in ecosystems and how it connects entire ecosystems by plants having mycorrhizal fungi on their roots. We'll also look at the interspecies nutrient exchange via those networks just within the ectomycorrhizal fungal symbiosis and its interaction between plants as well as different organisms. We'll also look at the role of ectomycorrhizal fungi in disturbance, such as mining sites and under the pressure of climate change. So firstly, let's discuss this concept of the wood wide web, because this is a lovely image in the same article I've mentioned earlier, where you can see how these fungi basically interconnect the ecosystem into this web-like connections that occur between plants. Some studies show that plants actually exchange carbon, give carbon, share the carbon below ground between plants as needed, because some of them can partner up with more than one plant species. So let's take a look at this one, for example. This is an ectomycorrhizal fungi growing on a tree, and it's producing mushrooms, and these are ectomycorrhizal as well. So one plant has many different ectomycorrhizal fungi. Now these might go back and forth between two species, but might not connect to any other species of tree. So it would just be a symbiosis between the fungi of one type and two plants, or even just one plant. Or the trees can actually be interconnected via multiple mycorrhizal networks across multiple tree species. It just depends on the specific species of plants and ectomycorrhizal fungi in the ecosystem. And then, of course, we've got avascular mycorrhizal fungi, which some tree species will also partner up with. So they're connecting the different successional stages of plants. And then we've got an orchid mycorrhiza, and they will only partner up with orchids, and they actually live in the ecosystem as well and provide nutrients and cycle nutrients, but they're just not going to partner up with any other plants because this symbiosis is so specific. So this is just basically an imagined scenario of what it might look like underground, given that the different symbiotic relationships between plants and fungi are so varied, and they can be very universal, like with avascular mycorrhizal fungi, versus very specific with only specific tree or plant species, like with the orchids. This interconnection then really potentially connects the entire forest ecosystem where communication is happening, because the one species of fungi can keep going from tree to tree and across forests, and you can just imagine the intense web-like interconnectedness of the forest ecosystem via these different fungal symbioses. So a good example of the wood wide web concept, or the interconnectedness of ecosystems via the ectomycorrhizal fungal network, is a study that was done in 2010, and Susan Simard is the leading scientist in this, and you can look up Susan online and find a lot of her videos discussing this concept of the mother tree and the interconnectedness of forests via the mycorrhizal network. So in this study, they actually looked at one species of tree, Douglas fir trees, that were present within a certain area of the forest, and how they were connected with one species of ectomycorrhizal fungal mycelium, and this species is called Rhizopogon. And basically, they found that this one tree, one of the oldest trees in that forest, was actually connected to 47 other Douglas fir trees. So basically, this avatar concept that we have of this mother tree was shown scientifically for the first time, perhaps. And so, over centuries, a single ectomycorrhizal species can potentially cover many square kilometers and network an entire forest. And this is where this just kind of hit the mainstream media, I suppose, and became what now scientists are calling an overemphasized concept. However, I think it's really powerful to think about the fact that forests are actually superorganisms in a way, that everything is connected, and whether it is true that one fungi can interconnect a whole forest or not, the fact that plants do share mycorrhizal networks to some extent is a very cool, really interesting idea and concept to think about, how nature is interconnected, and these mycorrhizal networks demonstrate that to some extent at least. Another great study that came out as well, and this was also by Susan Simard's team, was that in a mixed forest, when paper birch and Douglas fir were connected by the same ectomycorrhizal species, what they've looked at is that the paper birch at some point in winter will lose its leaves. So what happens to that tree over winter? How does it survive this period of winter? And it turns out that the Douglas fir, which is evergreen, actually passes on its nutrients via the mycorrhizal network that it's connected to the paper birch with. It actually provides photosynthetes. The fungi actually share the photosynthetes from the one species to the other. So it's not just one mother tree feeding all its babies, like in the last example, but it's more like the interconnectedness between different species. And this is what's kind of just really made it interesting on another level. And then the next part of the experiment was to show how when the paper birch actually grows new leaves over summer, it actually shades the Douglas fir tree, and the same thing happens. The photosynthetic carbon is fixed and travels to the mycorrhizal fungi, and then the fungi actually pass some of that carbon to the Douglas fir that is being shaded. And these fungi are the main way by which this can happen. So despite some recent doubts about the incredible sharing and caring nature of ecosystems through the ectomycorrhizal fungi, Susan Simard's and her team's work is constantly showing for this to be the case, showing the distribution of resources within the ecosystem between species and within the same species through the ectomycorrhizal fungal network, demonstrating just how nature works, that nature is a collaborative system set up for everything to flourish, not just this competition between species trying to get their way, but the opposite, where everything is geared towards the greater good. And Susan Simard's work is really portraying these concepts, and at the same time being mindful that climate change is putting a huge pressure on ecosystems. So a lot of the things we might be seeing in nature as competition is only because we've taken so much resource from the ecosystems. We've put so much pressure on it climatically, water-wise, nutrient-wise, depleted soils, cut down forests that may no longer be able to function in the same way that they're intended to function. This is where it becomes really tricky to actually show reality when the systems are under so much pressure. But I think from the Canadian studies that have been exemplified here, we can say that nature is definitely designed for this cooperative networking, as we will see in the next few examples. Another interesting way in which ectomycorrhizal fungi are playing a role is that in ecosystems coping with climate change. So Douglas fir is one of the dominant species in forests in the Northern Hemisphere, and because climate change is inducing longer and hotter summers that are also dry in nature as opposed to the usual rain that they used to receive during that time, these trees have succumbed to severe attack by specific insects, and as a result there's a huge dieback. As you can see here, these trees are dying, and there is a supposition that some southern species that occupy a similar niche will eventually replace these Douglas fir trees to stabilize the ecosystem. So in this study, they basically looked at ponderosa pine, which is a southern pine species, and the hypothesis was that there would be bulk nutrient transport, photosynthetic carbon flow and stored carbon that would be transferred to the ponderosa pine from the Douglas fir. And interestingly, not only was photosynthetic carbon transferred from Douglas fir to ponderosa pine, but also defense molecules which were produced in the Douglas fir against the insect feeding were also transferred into the ponderosa pine as warning signal for the ponderosa pine to also produce defense mechanisms against extreme insect feeding, so that the ponderosa pine could actually defend itself should it be under a similar attack. So this is interesting and very pertinent with what's happening in ecosystems with trees dying and being replaced by similar species that can actually withstand the climatic changes that are occurring. So it's a nice way of saving ecosystems by allowing these new species to come, but also understanding how they are able to colonize new land being challenged by climate change. So this is going to become really essential in ecosystem and forest conservation as climatic pressure keeps increasing. As all these studies indicate, it's a very complex system provided by mycorrhizal fungi in the interdependence of the plant community within an individual ecosystem. Susan Simard has written a chapter called Mycorrhizal Networks Facilitate Tree Communication, Learning and Memory. And this is in a book called Memory and Learning in Plants, Signaling and Communication in Plants. It's a fascinating chapter. I really recommend reading. It's not very long. And it basically summarizes this idea that scientists have, and Susan definitely has this strong opinion that the mycorrhizal network is actually a neural-like intelligence and communication system that indicates that the forest ecosystem being connected through the mycorrhizal network or the wood wide web is really like a superorganism. And the reason for this analogy is because the mycorrhizal network interconnecting trees within an ecosystem and other plants has the same network pattern as a neuron system in our brain, and the properties of this network are correlated with the local and global intelligence system that encompasses communication and memory-based learning. It is also interestingly based on neurotransmitter-like biochemical signals. So the similarities between the signaling molecules that are sent via ectomycorrhizal fungi throughout the ecosystem, the similarities between those biochemicals and neurotransmitters in our brain and the way they function are very parallel. And this provides tree perception of the ecology and the environment within which they find themselves. And this includes interplant communication, the strengths and needs and stresses that can be transmitted across these mycorrhizal networks. And there's a response within the ecosystem by other trees, neighboring plants, and the behaviors of organisms that interact with those plants are also modified through this system. There's also memory acquisition and storage and memory-based learning, which leads to adaptive behavior. So Susan says that the microbiome, particularly the ectomycorrhizal fungal network, facilitates sophisticated plant cognition that leads to perceptive intelligence and the agency of the destiny of individual plants and the ecosystem. So basically she's saying that through this communicative neuron-like intelligence, through these networks of ectomycorrhizal fungi, plants have choices and they modify their behavior based on the signaling that they receive to make the choices. And this is just the ectomycorrhizal fungi that are being looked at in most of these studies. However, when we look at that whole wood wide web concept, it also includes the several other different types of mycorrhizal fungi that we have spoken about. So it just makes it extremely more complex than is shown even through some of these experiments. So really what these examples are showing is that forest ecosystems are not based on this competition between species as is often thought of ecosystems where plants compete for sunlight and compete for this and compete for nutrients. It's really showing that it's a cooperative ecosystem with equal distribution of resources within the community. And I think it's a really nice example of what's possible when ecosystems are diverse and that there isn't just this survival of the fittest scenario and view of the world that has been promulgated through science and encouraged over time, and that nature is actually built for everyone to have their specific niche and specific role in the ecosystem and provide a service, and that some species actually are those service providers to serve other species, like the mycorrhizal fungi serving trees. And I think these beautiful studies are showing that the truth is different, that it's actually favorable to be in this biodiverse ecosystem where everyone supports one another. And I just love this idea, and I love this image representing this concept of the wood wide web. Now, another thing to remember, as always, is that these multi-species symbiosis between fungi and the plants, it doesn't end there, as we have seen in the last unit on our vascular mycorrhizal fungi. And a good example is this tuberculate Ectomycorrhiza nitrogen fixation, where lodgepole pine, which grows in nutrient-poor sites, is mycorrhizal with an ectomycorrhizal species called Suillus tomentosus, which is commonly known as the blue staining slippery jack. And it forms tubercles with nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So this adds another complexity of how nutrients are gained by another species providing a service to the symbiosis. So these tubercles are actually densely packed clusters of root tips enveloped by thick hyphal sheath. And you can see this happening here. This is a tubercle, a cross-section of it, and lots of lovely white hyphae growing, and there's the nitrogen fixing spot here and there, and this is what it looks like close up. So the bacteria are obviously engaged to help nitrogen fixation in this really poor rocky terrain that this symbiosis occurs in. These are tubercles formed by the root and this ectomycorrhizal species, and this addition of different species of nitrogen-fixing bacteria that are engaged in this symbiosis to allow the plant and the fungi to gain nitrogen. And of course, in return, the bacteria get nutrients and are looked after in this symbiotic relationship. Another way that fungi cooperate with bacteria is through bacterial farming. So it is thought that fungal hyphae are used by bacteria as fungal highways and use the hyphae as a dispersal mechanism. There is a species of ectomycorrhizal/saprotrophic fungi called Mochella crassipus. It's commonly known as the thick-footed morel, and it's known to farm Pseudomonas putida. And the bacteria get dispersal through this relationship. They get reared, where the fungi actually feed the bacteria, the fungal exudates, and they actually get habitually planted as well. So there's cultivation going on and also harvesting of sugars from the bacteria and bacterial carbon translocation, and harvesting as the carbon is translocated between bacteria and the fungi as well. The fungi receive carbon stored in sclerotia, so specific structures are created by the fungi and they actually accumulate and increase their carbon storage in these sclerotia as a mechanism to resist stress. And then melanin is also laid down in these structures to prevent water stress. So it's quite interesting how bacteria and fungi work together in order to gain benefits for themselves and work cooperatively in that way. With photosynthetic carbon compounds, there is this phenomenon called rhizosphere priming effect, where root carbon secretion influences accelerated organic matter decomposition by saprotrophic soil microbes. Another level of that is where hyphosphere priming effect also occurs, where ectomycorrhizal fungal hyphae can rapidly transfer plant photosynthetates to soil bacteria around the hyphosphere. So therefore, ectomycorrhizal fungi are seen as the ecosystem drivers, because not only does the root have this priming effect, but then there's another layer of that through the mycorrhizal network and the hyphosphere environment, the hyphosphere ecosystem. Another way where there's great benefits to having ectomycorrhizal fungi in the ecosystem is when there's a disturbance, so such as fire, for example. A friend of mine took these photos. She's actually seen these giant fungi grow after fire. And what happens is that new tree seedlings will come up eventually after the fire. And when the fungi have been through this trauma within the ecosystem, it is essential that they must spread their spores and colonize the new seedlings that sprout after fire. So it makes sense that if the conditions are right, these fungi will actually come up, disperse their spores, and colonize new seedlings coming up, have their spores available in the environment to regenerate and restore this ecosystem as soon as possible, to get things moving again, to colonize as many plants as possible, to help the environment recover, for plants to get nutrients, for the seedlings to start growing rapidly and receive nutrients. So yes, the fungi are protecting themselves as well by doing that, but their role in the ecosystem is to provide that service to actually colonize as many plants as possible in order for nutrient access for those plants. This is also seen in mining sites, where sometimes near mining sites there are trees that are tolerant to higher heavy metal concentrations than normal. And these fungi that are present on their roots allow trees or other plants to exist in these high concentrations of heavy metals. And there's various ways as to how fungi actually deal with these heavy metals. We've talked about that with avascular mycorrhizal fungi, where they can prevent entry into the plant cells, or there are some plants that are hyperaccumulators of heavy metals, and the fungi actually drive this accumulation of heavy metals in the plants. So there are various mechanisms as to how that happens, and these fungi can be isolated from these plants that are growing near or at mining sites and applied to particular plant species in order to regenerate or rehabilitate mining sites, in order to restore the ecosystem by actually having trees take over the site again and prevent the leaching and losses of these heavy metals that are then going into ecosystems. It's a very nice way to be able to work with plant/mycorrhizal symbiosis, where plants are more likely to grow as a result of having protective mycorrhizal fungi on their roots. And so ectomycorrhizal fungi are actually important in low pH scenarios as well. So they have been studied for rehabilitation of acid soils, where there's high heavy metal potential in the soil, like such as we've just discussed with mining sites, or where there's very low nutrient cycling and very low decomposition. They can be used in environments that are compromised in order to rehabilitate them and help them grow. And in Europe, these fungi have been used extensively and studied extensively for their ability to protect trees from heavy metal toxicity, and therefore being able to allow ecosystem recovery in these damaged areas. So this is it for lesson 5.2 on ectomycorrhizal fungi. Our next lesson is going to be on saprotrophic fungi. These fungi are the recyclers, so they're the ones that deal with wood decomposition. They're not symbiotic. They allow nutrient cycling by decomposing organic matter. So we'll look at those in detail as to their role in ecosystems, and you shall hear from me in lesson 5.3. See you then.